Good morning. Now,
Mr. Allan Bennett.
Mr. Bennett. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Bennett. Now, as you appreciate, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you're prepared to affirm.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bennett. Now, we have you scheduled for 2 days, although I'm bearing in mind that we will be aiming to finish before 3 tomorrow. We'll take coffee breaks at about 11:30, but as I say to all witnesses, if you want to take a break at any time, just give me an indication and we'll take a break. The other thing I'd like to say is you've quite a large space to fill. There's the assistance of the microphones, but can I encourage you to speak maybe a little more slowly than you might otherwise speak and a little bit louder than you would. I mean, it's not always easy, but
Okay.
I'm very conscious of this because my hearing is not what it was. Now, Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Bennett, you have produced two reports that we're going to ask you about in the course of this session of your evidence. One on ventilation deficiencies, which I'll come to in a moment, and another on cryptococcus.
Yes.
And in each case, you were also asked a series of what one might describe as supplementary questions, and you produced written replies to these questions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. So if we go to we'll deal with these in due course, but if we can go to the first of them for identification, can we go to volume 21, sorry, bundle 21, volume 1, page 611. Now, presumably you recognize that as the report that you produced on that topic.
I do.
You do. Thank you very much. There isn't, in fact, a statement from you. You simply produced these reports and supplementary material. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if we go to page 613, I'm going to come to your CV just in a moment, but I just want to check exactly what you were asked to do. You were asked to address questions from a microbiological perspective, and in particular whether the ventilation systems were in an unsafe condition in the sense that it presented an additional risk of avoidable infection, and then whether that had changed. Now, just while I'm on that page, I think you probably understand that one view expressed in this inquiry is that you can't just look at ventilation because there are other things that are done to keep people safe in their rooms, as they now are in the new hospital. And I think you touch on that later in your report when you mentioned bundles.
Yes.
That's something you're familiar with.
Yes, often in hospital infection control, a series of infection control practices are referred to as a bundle, which may be hand washing, it may be isolation rooms, it may be wearing of protective equipment, etc., etc.
But what your expertise lies in the ventilation element.
In this case, yes, I'm aware of certain aspects of other infection control practices, but I was not asked to address them in the report.
Perhaps we can just have a look at your experience and qualifications. Maybe important just to pause a little bit on that for a moment. So if we go to page 614, In paragraph 2.1, you narrate your early career, including time at the now defunct National Engineering Laboratory in East Kilbride, before you went down to Portondown. And essentially what you tell us there is that from 1988 until 2023, under various labels, you worked at Portondown. Is that right?
That is correct.
And in terms of what you were actually doing there, you say in paragraph 2.2 that your research interests of 35 years have been around airborne transmission of infection and its prevention. So that's what you've been focusing on, is that right?
That has been a major focus of my working career at Portondown.
Yeah, and you narrate that you've led a research group of 10 to 20 scientists, and you mentioned various projects. In 2.3, you mentioned testing equipment used in various places, including healthcare, including, I see, filters and air samplers, which we've heard a bit about in this inquiry. Is that the kind of thing you were looking at?
Yes, I have some experience of testing laboratories to ensure that they have the correct air change rates, pressure differentials, and to make sure that the filters are operating correctly.
Then in paragraph 2.4, you say you've experience of leading investigations of microbial contamination of air in a variety of locations. A little excursion into anthrax due to drumming.
Yes.
And the investigation about animal skins, if I recollect correctly.
Yes, it was a fatal case of anthrax in the Scottish borders, and also into another fatal case in London. And in both cases, it was associated with the playing and possible manufacture of djembe drums.
And you do seem to then be involved in advising in various pandemics. You say the 2009-2010 influenza pandemic and the COVID pandemic. Further on in 2.4, going on to the top of page 615 in your report. So again, were you looking at airborne transmission? Is that what you were focusing on?
There's two aspects of this. One, I led teams who air sampled in hospitals around patients with influenza and with SARS-CoV-2 to measure the potential emission of aerosol particles from those patients. I also, during the COVID pandemic, especially during the early stages, was part of a subgroup of SAGE looking at environmental factors in the transmission of COVID, looking at things like ventilation, disinfection, etc., and to give advice to the main SAGE group.
Sure. And you actually say at the end of paragraph 2.4 that the results of your studies, you say, impacted on infection control guidance. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the results of those studies, it wasn't just air studies, the study of how long the organism survives in surfaces, it did impact on infection control guidance for the wider public.
See. In paragraph 2.6, you mention a slightly different issue, which is high containment facilities, but presumably also concerned with transmission in the air. Is that what you're focusing on there?
I think what I'm trying to get across. I sort of understand a certain amount about the design and building of complex facilities that involve specialist ventilation systems.
And in 2.7, you tell us that you're a member of the International Editor editorial board of the Journal of Hospital Infection since 2017.
Yeah.
Where you're looking at publications on the environment and infection control in healthcare. Is that right?
That's correct. So the journal sends me papers in my specialist area, which I review to assess whether they're suitable for publication, and also to maybe suggest changes that need to be made.
And then also in that paragraph, you tell us you were involved in investigating the Northern Ireland neonatal Pseudomonas
Yes,
outbreak. Is that right?
that's correct, yes.
And also a global outbreak of another bacteria we've been hearing about during the inquiry, of Mycobacteria shelloni.
Yeah,
Although in your case it was associated with cardiac surgery, is that right?
that's correct, yes, yeah.
And there's next one, is that a third investigation? Zinc-associated antimicrobial resistant gram-negatives.
Yes, yes.
That was a different one.
Yes, they're all different groups. I mean, the group I led in UK HSA, we tended to be called in to give specialist, to carry out specialist research in environmental transmission of various microorganisms, often associated with the use of equipment and often associated with potential airborne transmission.
Sure. If we go on to 616, you say that you're an expert in the transmission of airborne microorganisms and the prevention of their spread, but you acknowledge, I think, and this is a point that some are interested in, you've no clinical expertise, you haven't been a doctor.
No, I've never had any clinical practice.
And you haven't worked directly in a hospital environment other than when you've been carrying out your research, is that right?
Yes, I've never had a day-to-day job in a hospital, but I have visited a reasonable number of hospitals in the UK.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, when the inquiry's already heard a lot of evidence about ventilation generally, so I may not need to take you to the whole of your material on the introductory section, but that starts on page 616, where you say, well, you need to understand what was in place and also how air is involved in the transmission of organisms. Is that right?
Yes.
And were you given an understanding of what was in place at the, what was actually built at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
I was given access to a wide range of documents about the hospital and about its construction and well, a very wide range of documents which I've referred to. But I have to say, I only visited the hospital once in the date in October 2023. So I don't necessarily have a great knowledge of the in-depth knowledge of walking around the hospital, if you know what I mean. I was there for a short period of time.
And were you, so you're proceeding on the documents that you were given. Do you know anything about what oral discussions did or did not take place about ventilation decisions at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital? Or were you just working on documents?
Well, I mean, I wasn't there, so yes, and if oral discussions were not written down, I would not know of any evidence of oral discussions.
I might just ask you at that point, I mean, if somebody is going to make a significant decision about how the ventilation system is to be structured or any proposed alterations to the changes or anything of that kind, would you normally expect to see something in writing?
I think anything that has an impact on infection control, or in fact anything that has an impact on the design and the cost and etc. of the building, I would expect to see some form of written evidence and a rationale for decisions.
In the paragraph 4.2, you say that the primary function of ventilation is to provide a comfortable environment, and you say it's also intended to protect patients from exposure to microorganisms in the air. And we'll come back to one or two questions about that a little later. But you describe hospitals as unusual public spaces. Why do you call them unusual public spaces?
Maybe I dealt often with spaces in which people move through on a transient basis. So, for example, we will come into this room at 10 o'clock and we'll leave at 4 o'clock, and we'll be here for maybe 4 hours during that period of time, and that's our exposure. But in a hospital, the patients are there 24 hours a day. So they need to be protected 24 hours a day.
And are there other people who need to be protected other than simply the patients?
Well, the staff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
And well, you have a duty of care for anybody in your building, so staff, visitors,
Thank you. And then you make a point in paragraph 4.3 that ventilation has perhaps gone up the list of things people are interested in since the COVID pandemic. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's a very fair comment.
And do you think things have changed post-COVID in terms of attitudes to ventilation?
I think they have. I think there are there's a lot more lobbying, a lot more pressure groups looking at improving ventilation, and also some international organizations seem to be pushing up ventilation as a priority.
You go on in paragraph 4.4 to record, as we know, that the Queen Elizabeth Hospital is fully sealed, mechanically ventilated, no natural ventilation. And then you say that the decision was taken at least partially due to concerns about odours from the neighbouring facility. Is that something that you were told in documents, or why do you say that?
I think I've read that in a number of documents that were written around before the building was finally designed and constructed. From design teams and I think, well, I mean, I can't say for definite, but yes.
I think you say it was partly due to that. Have you had to look at any range of documents about why the building is where it is, or has that not been within your remit?
I've been asked to write a report assessing the impact of the proximity to the sewage treatment works.
Yeah, which is a separate document. No
Yes.
doubt. Yes. We'll all look at on another day. But subject to that, for the purpose of this report, why the building is sited where it was, that wasn't within your remit, was it?
No, I don't think it's part of the remit of this report or the cryptocurrency report either.
Thank you. And you simply record, which I think we know, that carbon filtration had been proposed and then wasn't in the end result used. So we can move on to 618. You start with the topic dilution of air. and probably material that the inquiry has heard from various witnesses, but you're saying there that the provision of the supply is to provide a comfortable environment and to remove contaminants. Is that right?
Yes, and maybe to remove heat as well.
Sorry?
To remove heat.
Remove heat as well. Now, we've had a lot of discussions about air changes and litres per second and other measures of the movement of air in a patient space. In paragraph 4.6, you talk about it in the context of air changes per hour.
Yes.
Is that what you're used to doing?
I think generally amongst infection control people and among people in my field, we've always used air changes per hour as as a measure of ventilation.
Yeah.
However, I am aware that the more wider architects and engineers are starting to use litres per second, litres per person per second, which is something I never really have used in my career.
And then you recorded that paragraph something we've heard a lot about, an air change rate of 6 for wards and single rooms and 10 for specialist facilities. And you referenced HTM and SHTM references for that. And are you making a point at the end of that paragraph about why air change rates measured in this way are good? Because they can be measured and monitored easily.
I mean, I'm sure the litres per person per second, well, I mean, you can't really monitor how many people there are in a room, but I mean, that could be monitored with a nominal number of people.
Whereas air change can be monitored, air change rate.
I think it's easier to monitor because you know the volume of the room and you know the airflow, so you can monitor it like that. When it's 8 litres per person per second, if you had to monitor, you would have to decide on the nominal number of people within the area that you're ventilating.
This is just a point of detail. In 4.7, you touch on the litres per second provision, and you reference Scottish building standards. And then you say fresh air provision rate is not currently used as a specification in relevant healthcare guidance. Now, I'm not sure we need to dig it out, but NSS tells me that there is a provision in SHTM 0301 Part A 2022, paragraph 422, that says in the absence of other guidance, 10 litres per person per second should be taken as a minimum ventilation.
But that's in the absence of other guidance, when there is already guidance for 6 air changes and 10 air changes per hour.
Could I just have that again? This is what NSS had brought to your attention, Mr.
Yes, well,
Cullen.
the quotation, I mean, we have obviously all the documents available if need be, but the quotation is to SHTM 0301 Part A 2022, paragraph 4.22.
And what's the point they're trying to make?
That in general areas and wards, this guidance says, I'm told, so it says, in the absence of other guidance, 10 litres per second per person should be taken as a minimum ventilation requirement.
Right, thank you. So
I think they may be addressing public areas, not wards and not patient rooms.
That would seem to follow, because there's other guidance which does address these areas. Yeah.
One of the points that a number of witnesses have been keen to stress to us, Mr. Bennett, and it appears you would agree with them, is that it's not just a question of talking about air change rates and pressures, but what can be important is the direction that the air moves. Is that of significance in a healthcare setting?
Yes. Obviously, if you have a patient with tuberculosis, for example, in a room, you want to be sure that none of that air from that room gets outside the room and potentially infects other people. Therefore, you want the air from outside to go into that room to make sure that any aerosol generated is extracted and doesn't go into occupied area. On the other hand, if you have a patient who is severely immunocompromised and is at danger of being exposed to maybe common microorganisms, you then will want them to be in a room in which the directional airflow, filtered air supply is in the room, and the air from that room goes out into into the ward or the adjacent area to protect that person from other patients, staff, and environmental sources of infection.
And what you've done in this section of your report, as you indicate at the end of paragraph 4.8, is just touch on the basic principles of how this operates.
That is correct.
And in 4.9, you're dealing with the infectious person, such as the one with tuberculosis. Just a point of detail, you say in the middle of 4.9, normal practice house them in a negative pressure space where all air from the room will be extracted. Is it all air that is extracted? Is it as absolute as that?
Yes, yes.
Does some of the air not mix and dilute?
Well, all the air will at some time be removed from the room. So you'll have an extract system which pulls a certain volume of air per second from that room. And if the room's got 10 air changes, that means 10 times the volume of the room will be extracted from the room. Sorry, the volume will be extracted from the room.
Thank you. And then 4.10, we come to the example you gave about immunocompromised patients. I just wanted to pause on that just for a second, because you point out, no doubt correctly, that these patients are highly vulnerable to infections by opportunistic pathogens. And then you say in the middle of that paragraph, these agents may be common environment agents or be human derived from other patients, staff, or visitors.
Yes.
So in your experience, that's a possible source of challenge to the vulnerable patient, is that correct?
Yes, yes. I mean, all this is obviously a clinical decision of where the vulnerability of the patient will depend on a clinical assessment of, for example, their white blood count, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can we go on to page 620? Just wanted to make sure I'm understanding that the point you're making in paragraph 4.11. If I'm understanding it correctly, what you're saying there about, you're saying, well, the level of pressure decided by national guidance and the magnitude required to avoid fluctuations from positive to negative. Now, is that something about, if you want negative, it can't be just negative, or positive, just positive. There has to be a sufficient amount of positivity or negativity in the pressure. Is that the point you're making?
Yes. I mean, if you have, for example, a room at 10 pascals positive pressure, and it fluctuates by, because things do fluctuate, it fluctuates by 2 pascals, then you will get something between 8 and 12 pascals positive. However, if you set the room at 1 pascal positive and it has a 2 pascal swing, then that'd be from minus 1 Pascal to 3 Pascal. So if the pressure differential is set too low, there is a possibility that it may swing in the other direction.
Yeah. And presumably that then has consequences for the intended treatment of the patient, whether you're removing infective items with a positive pressure or you're trying to keep them out.
Yes, it does. Yes.
In the next section, and you're dealing, I think, largely still with introductory material, you're talking about filtration, and you talk about HEPA filters, which we've heard quite a lot about, and where they may be installed. And the point that I think we've had from other witnesses that you need to monitor them to see whether they're blocking up and becoming less efficient as a matter of routine.
I mean, there's different reasons for monitoring the HEPA filters. You can monitor the pressure drop across a filter, because if the filter gets blocked, it may affect the flow, the volume of air going into an area. But there's also, with HEPA filters, if there is a requirement in specialist facilities to test them on, I think, an annual basis in order to show that they're performing correctly.
Can you help me with a term which no doubt I should understand but don't? Room junction, which we see, for example, in 413.
That just means, in some instances, and I don't think in the QEUH hospital, you can put filters basically like there on the actual ceiling.
Right.
So, but that is not done at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. So
because,
it's a bit irrelevant.
Because the HEPA filters are, as it were, further back in the system. But if I wanted to know what room junction means, it's the interface between the ventilation system and the actual space, the room space. Yeah, thank you.
And then finally on HEPA filters, you mentioned at the bottom of that page the portable filters, which we've heard a little bit about and which you touch on later. And you make a point about what they do and don't do there, portable HEPA filters. So
if you've got a room, if there's a HEPA filter in the supply to a room, then you cut no environmental, well, it really cuts down any chances of environmental organisms entering a room. If you've got a recirculating HEPA filter in a room, those agents can get into the room, but then they will be filtered out by the recirculating HEPA filter, but they will be in the room. They will get into the room. Also, the thing about portable HEPA filters is they are not generally tested. So people do not test them on a regular basis to see whether they're still operating correctly. And obviously, since some of them are on the floor, they may be subject to being used as door stops, or they may be accidentally kicked, or in some instances, they accidentally switched off. So that they don't have the same assurance and performance of a supply HEPA filter.
Would I be right in thinking that if your HEPA filter is at some point in the source of the incoming air, it will trap either 99.98 or 99.9 of incoming pathogens, depending on size. But with the portable HEPA filter, I'm imagining something that is sitting somewhere in the room. It will be a random, to an extent it's a random event as to whether any particle which has come into the room encounters the filter, or is there a mathematical inevitability that it will encounter the filter?
I think with these filters, a lot depends on flow rate through the filter. Are they just putting a tiny part of the air in that room through a filter, or are they correctly sized? And also, where are they positioned? So if you had a small recirculating HEPA filter in that corner there, the person over there will almost definitely not get any benefit from it. So it depends how many air changes the additional air changes they supply for a room, if you know, clean air changes.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't see anything. So having a small one in a big room won't do anything, but having a big one in the small room will be better.
Right.
But the problem you get with sometimes you get concerns about noise, and sometimes you get concerns that people are accidentally switching them off because they don't know what they are, or people unplugging them and putting something else in the plug socket.
Let me just repeat the question. If we have a HEPA filter in the corner and we're concerned with the impact of that HEPA filter on the air quality in a larger space, I think mean, this is my ignorant suggestion. It would seem to me that if there is somewhere in the space something you want to filter out, something you want to filter out, would I be right in thinking that it's a rather random, that it is random as to whether or not that thing you want to filter out ever encounters your HEPA filter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these things that if you want to pay somebody to do computer modeling of something like that, you can get figures for this. It's going to depend on where the aerosol source is, where the portable HEPA filter is, and the amount of air that goes through the portable HEPA filter.
Right. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cole.
Yep, I'm content to move from portable HEPA filters now, Mr. Bennett. You deal in the next section with what you describe as practicalities. You mentioned something we've heard of from other witnesses, that usually systems are designed with some extra capacity, what you describe, I think, as oversized, because fan performance reduces over time. And also, you say, to allow for the potential of increased airflow in the future. Is that something that's normally built into a system in your experience?
I'm not an expert on the construction of hospitals in the UK, but in my experience of other facilities, there is margins built in so that you're not using everything 100%, so that there is a potential to increase the flow through a system.
I think other witnesses have suggested perhaps that it's easier to spend some extra money building in the flexibility at the start, because it can be difficult to change things later. Would you agree?
Oh yes, I mean I think that is the trick of designing buildings with which require a good ventilation system, is that if you don't get it right first time, then you're going to have to strip everything out and put something else in, and that causes disruption and increased cost.
Thank you. Bearing in mind that the report was prepared a little while back before we had a lot of the evidence that we've now heard, you then go on to deal with various types of isolation rooms and you give general descriptions of these. You talk on page 622 of negative pressure rooms, and you set out when they're used. You talk about positive pressure rooms on the next page, but the next item you deal with is these PPVL rooms. Now, we've had quite a lot of evidence about PPVL rooms. And you, I think, when you're talking about them, assume they can be used for two types of patients. Is that right?
They have been used for in some cases for both immunosuppressed patients with an aerosol transmissible disease, but also for patients who are immunosuppressed and have a transmissible disease.
And why are they capable of, I mean, there's a debate as to whether they're set up properly and whether they have other issues, but why are they, at least in principle, capable of dealing with both of these?
Because of the air direction, because there is no way for aerosol to be moved from the room through the positive pressure lobby and out of the, as long as the air change rate is high enough in the lobby, and move out into the general ward. And it also provides a supply of HEPA filtered air for the immunosuppressed patient. Now, you know, a lot of this, sometimes you've got to look in the detail of some of these things, and sometimes, you know, there may be, you know, the rooms have got to be used properly. There's no point having any isolation room and somebody jams the door open, you know, for example, or is in and out of the room on a sort of regular basis.
When you comment on PPVL rooms, you refer to a study, sounds a bit Dutch, like a Dutch study to me, and it doesn't matter. At the top of page 623, I won't try to pronounce the name, but the 2020.
It's actually an Irish.
That was an Irish one. There we are.
That's a bit counterintuitive.
It's been suggested that the study in question didn't involve very extensive exercise. It was only two isolation rooms over 8 weeks, and the authors suggest perhaps a bigger study would be a good idea. Would you agree?
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I was just using it as mentioning that people have used PPVLs to house infectious patients.
Yeah, thank you. And then, as I said earlier, you go on to positive pressure isolation rooms, and I'm not going to ask you about that. And you touch on chilled beams, and I'm going to ask you about that a little later, because you just deal with it by way of introduction at this point. So, having had that introduction, you then go on in section 5 to head this section as air microbiology. So this is where you're trying to look at what the potential link is between ventilation and infection. Is that right?
Yes, I'm trying to look at what the potential sources of microorganisms in the air that could be a potential hazard for patients.
And you make the point in 5.2 that there are lots of organisms floating around in the air to which we're all exposed, but some people may suffer if they are exposed to them.
Yes.
In section 5.4, I think you're indicating there that there's been some revisiting of the question of how things like SARS is transmitted. Is that right?
The potential for aerosol transmission of diseases like influenza and SARS has long been a point of disagreement between different scientists about to what degree they are capable of being transferred longer distances. And this became quite political and quite a major argument during SARS-CoV-2 about how much transmission was long distance, i.e. longer than 1 or 2 meters. I
So
think
this is why we had discussions about keep 2 meters away from each other
Exactly.
and so on.
Exactly. But it's like anything, it's a spectrum, in my viewpoint. You know, and I was a co-author of a paper in which we did manage to find a few papers that seemed to be showing longer than 2 meter transmission of SARS-CoV-2 from the scientific literature of reasonably high status papers.
Yeah. One of these is just so we know where these are the 2 papers that are referenced in the latter part of paragraph 5.4, and the details are in the footnotes.
Yes.
And I'm not going to ask you to look these up. And you say, well, it depends on the amount of aerosol, particle size, how infectious it is, and so on.
Yes.
Then you make a point that's particularly aimed at people in hospital, I think, that you say duration of exposure increases the risk.
Yes.
So is this your 24 hours point?
Yes.
So unlike, me going down to my local restaurant and going in and moving around there, the inpatient essentially stays in one location.
Yes. Yes. So the patient will be, for example, if there's one patient with disease X and a patient who isn't exposed to that in the same ward, the fact that they're there for 24 hours means that exposure, they may not be exposed to high concentrations, but they're exposed for a long time.
And then you go on in your general discussion here, having dealt in that section with airborne transmission, to another topic that you obviously studied during COVID, I think, in particular contamination of surfaces. Is that right?
Yes.
How you can pick things up. I see here particles contaminating bedding may be re-aerialized. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's been demonstrated.
So you describe that as a risk which is lower than direct transmission, but might be significant.
Yes, for some diseases.
And then the next section is direct exposure to an environment. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And you list there things like Aspergillus and Cryptococcus, commonly found in outside air.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And also Aspergillus.
Yes. Yeah.
Arising from water damage. Is that right?
It can can arise from building works. It can arise from various things. But I think there was evidence of Aspergillus growing in water damaged surfaces in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
Yeah, you make the point about building works in that answer, and I think you say that aerosolization of fungal opportunistic pathogens has been linked to building and demolition works. Is that right?
Yes.
Look at the
Yes, it
top
has,
of
yes.
page 626. And steps need to be taken to protect against that.
Yes. Yeah.
And then other agents frequently found in showers and so on. Is that right?
They can be found. Yes, they can be found in water and showers.
And then you deal with indirect transmission. And then in 510 on page 626, you deal with the issue of particle size. Just tell us what you're trying to explain in that section.
Yeah, okay. Basically, when we, for example, when we maybe sneeze or cough or whatever, and we're infected with an agent, we create, we generate particles from a respiratory tract. If these particles are of a large size, they will say it's me. I'm doing this respiratory process. The larger particles will deposit out reasonably quickly, so they will hit the desk. They'll hit the computer screen in front of me. However, if I generate small particles, say around 1 and 2 micron, they will be capable of remaining in the air for significant amounts of time, and they may even reach you across this large circular table, and you would have the potential of breathing them in. So generally, ventilation doesn't impact on the larger particles because they're not around for long enough for ventilation to be a big deal. However, for the small particles with which will remain in air for a reasonable amount of time, that's the sort of particles that ventilation is capable of stripping out. So having a large air change rate won't, if I have a person next to me and I sneeze on them, whether it's 2 air changes or 22 air changes, they're still hit. But if I produce a small particle, then that air change difference will have an impact on your risk of breathing in that particle.
And that is because of the dilution effect,
Yes.
which higher rather than lower air change rates
Will remove the
will
particle
achieve.
quicker by dilution.
Right.
Yeah, we'll come back to some calculations on that in a minute, because you go on to say, you explain larger particles have more infectious agents than smaller particles, and so on. Can I just ask you, paragraph 513, you say filtration of liquids is often defined by particle size cutoffs. This is not the case for particulate filtration. Now, just help us understand what point you're making there, please.
I think sometimes people, well, basically, when you have a HEPA filter, many studies have been carried out, and the particle size most likely to penetrate through a HEPA filter is between 0.1 and 0.3 microns. Now, below that and above that, the efficiency of a filter will be higher. So when it says the filter is 99.95 efficient, it is tested with particles between 0.1 and 0.3 microns. And in reality, it's probably more efficient for particle sizes of higher than that. The other point I'm making is that often viruses can be of a size like 0.1 micron. But in reality, when we generate an aerosol from our bodies, it's not just a virus that's coming out. It's mucus, it's bits of cells, it's bits of other stuff. So the virus is not naked. It tends to be covered in something, so it tends to be of a bigger particle size than you would expect by the size of the virus.
Right, just so that I'm following that, the point that I'm taking from that, and there may be other points to take, is that although the pathogen, what you're trying to prevent coming in contact with a vulnerable person, may be of the order of 0.1 micron, in other words, very, very small, you will, a HEPA filter which is effectively filtering out particles in excess of 0.3 microns, will actually trap at least a significantly large number of the pathogens, because the pathogens will typically be part of a larger package, or however one,
Yes.
whatever metaphor one uses. I mean, have I got the point you were making?
Yes, I mean the point is that the filters are, the 99.95 is a minimal value. They probably are more effective against larger particles.
Oh, okay.
And what they're tested with are particles of a particular size, is that right?
Yes.
And is that where the 99.5 comes in?
Basically, your engineers will spray aerosols or something called dispersed oil particles of that size, and they will measure the concentration before and after the filter. And from that data, they will calculate percentage efficiency. And if that percentage efficiency is within spec, they will pass the filter for use.
Thank you.
So if you've got a filter that was tested in 2023 and shown to be 99.95%, and tested in 2024 and shown to be 99.95%, you pretty well know that, and it's the same efficiency, you pretty well know that that's been performing like that all through the year.
The next general topic you deal with is inhalation of infectious aerosols, and you explain where they lodge in the human body. I just wanted to, I wanted to come back to the calculation that you do here in 515. You say people at complete rest inhale approximately 6 liters of air per minute, and this can be used as a rule of thumb. And then you do calculation in page 628. Can you just take us through that?
I think what I'm just trying to show is that how big a volume that somebody breathes per day. So they breathe almost 9 cubic meters of air per day. So I'm just trying to show that the actual volume that somebody breathes, over the course of a day is 9 cubic meters. I mean, that's a very, very small room. The volume, all the air in a very, very, well, probably a cupboard, 3 meters, but no, yeah, I mean that's a tiny room. Sorry,
So you're trying to point out the amount that somebody
yes,
breathes in,
during the 24-hour period of time.
and that's a patient at complete rest.
Yeah.
So the patient who might move about a bit breathe in more or less?
Yes, they will. They'll breathe in a lot more.
A lot more.
Yes.
Thank you. In the next section, you're dealing with generation of infectious aerosols, and to some extent, we've probably touched on this already in the discussion about the debates during COVID. So I won't ask you to go back there. When you're coming on in 629 to deal with the environment, we encounter fungal spores. So they apparently can travel considerable distances, is that right?
Well, some fungal spores have got mechanisms which facilitate their spread in the air.
And small particle sizes, quite often.
Yes.
And then you make a point, I think some other witnesses have talked about, that if you're going to get aerosols from liquids, you need to insert an amount of energy in order to aerosolize into the smaller particles. Is that right?
Correct, yes. Yeah.
Now, air sampling. We've had quite a lot of discussion about the pros and cons of air sampling. And there are two types that you discuss, two types of sampling. One at 520, which is a sampling mechanism which pulls air over an agar plate. Is that right?
Yes.
And then you see what then develops from that. And we'll come back just in a second, but the other idea is you just do a particle count.
Yes.
And that tells you numbers, but not what they are. Is that right?
So if you want to have a general idea, a rapid idea of the cleanliness of a room, using a particle counter will measure the number of particles within a size range, and that is that will give you a rapid readout. If you're doing microbiological air sampling, you're going to have to wait a period of time to get the result, but that result can tell you what the microorganism is and what concentration of microorganism it is. However, as somebody who has done a lot of air sampling in this time, it's all about where you put the sampler and when you switch it on, and that's always an important thing.
Yeah, is that the point you're making in 521? Okay, you need the right sampler, you need the right media, but it depends where you're sampling and when.
It can be very difficult to assess the meaning of a negative sample, because you could have sampled at the wrong time in the wrong place. You could be using the wrong equipment. You could be using the wrong agar plate. So it's not an easy thing to do.
And does that affect its utility when you're trying to investigate something that's happened at an earlier point in time when you haven't been sampling?
Yes, I think the problem I think you have is just because it's not here today doesn't mean it wasn't there 2 weeks ago.
Thank you. Now, you go on in the next section, and I'll probably not delay you much on this, to touch on patient placements and the standard patient placement arrangements. And you actually have lifted a number of the sections of this report straight from the SOP that you were provided with. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And I just wanted to ask the one point, just so we don't completely miss it, on page 633, remember I asked you about PPVL rooms?
Yes.
And how they're set up?
Yes.
And you've made the point near the foot of 633 that in all instances in the new hospital, there's an additional extract in variable locations in the ceiling of the patient room. Do you have any particular comment on how that affects things?
To be honest, I need to see a diagram and need to see a visualization before I could make any comment.
And then your only comment appears on 635, where you say there are various standing operating procedures available. You haven't seen them before 2022. And you're just making the point there's no air change rates or pressure differentials defined for the BMT rooms.
Yeah, just an observation.
And the concept of single rooms,
Yep.
You touch on briefly on page 635. And you're saying that they tend to be a slight negative pressure just by having the ensuite, is that right?
I mean, that tends to be because you have an extract from the toilet area. So it tends to get, and I think they're defined in the SHTMs as being 0 or slightly negative. But what I'm trying to sort of state there is there is a potential for air to move both directions in these rooms. They're nominally negative pressure, but that pressure can fluctuate because there's no monitoring. And for example, if somebody decides they want their room at 28 degrees and somebody next door wants a room at 17 degrees, there will be flow of air from one to another.
And you made the point about leaving doors open. So can we move on to another section, section 7, the use of ventilation and guidance. So you start by telling us that ventilation as a strategy to reduce infection is not a new topic. It's been around for a long time.
I think since Florence Nightingale, and probably before.
But there's more attention on it at the moment. Now, there's quite a lot of discussion about the evidence behind guidance. Guidance it is, but nevertheless, you're dealing with that in 7.2. Can you just what point are you trying to make in this paragraph? What are you trying to explain to us?
I mean, I've probably a few points. I mean, I think one of the things, you know, in medical science and in biological science, things move very quickly, and you know, things change, and all the evidence you're looking at is often from the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. However, in this area, most of the big studies were carried out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and haven't really been sort of repeated. Partly because they were regarded as being of a high enough quality for people to act upon them. Also, I think it's very difficult to come up with an experiment in which you house 10 vulnerable patients without positive pressure rooms and 10 vulnerable patients with a positive pressure room. A lot of this stuff is very difficult to do nowadays.
Notwithstanding the age of the material which gives rise to this guidance, has the guidance remained the same, essentially?
Yes, I think because of, I think a limited amount of studies carried out in those days, and then people learning from those studies and designing hospitals to match those sort of findings.
And in fact, you instanced the one that various people have referred to, the Lidwell study as one of the bases for this material. Is that right?
Yes.
And you explain on 636 going on to 637 what was actually done to calculate things in the Lidwell study. Well,
I mean, most of Lidwell's stuff was mathematical, and he was relying on some other studies. I think possibly the value is going back to Lidwell. Well, I mean, basically he was basically showing, I think, what we call a protection factor. So if we imagine, for example, he says the directional airflow could greatly reduce the transfer of aerosol particles from isolation to adjacent room by about 10 to the 3. That means that if you have a an isolation room and you've got 1,000 particles, only one of those particles will go into the next room if you've got that directional flow. However, if you don't have that flow, all of them will go. So you're giving a protection of 1,000 against exposure to airborne particles by the use of that directional airflow. And he showed that by having a positive pressure ventilated lobby, this seemed to increase the factor up to 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 7. So therefore, this is giving you a very, very high level of protection. Obviously, this requires the room to be operated correctly and to be shown to be operating correctly. But he demonstrates that by mathematics, but also by having his mathematics confirmed by studies using different particulate tracers.
I think that the point you make about correct functioning was picked up by a later researcher who said, well, we looked at these rooms, but actually they weren't being operated correctly, which diminished the effect of the research.
I mean, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but at one stage of time in the United States, they had rooms with switches that they could switch from positive to negative. And sometimes people made a mistake or weren't trained enough, and they actually put, for example, TB patients in positive pressure rooms, which meant that the air was going from the infected case into the general ward, and that caused outbreaks. So I think it's one thing very important is for people to understand the operation of such rooms and to be au fait with how they should be operating.
And you if we go on to page 638, it appears that your group did a study on this, on one of these topics anyway, 638 going on to 639.
Yes, we did this. This was for done in microbiology laboratories, but also in a clean room facility. And what we did was generated aerosols. I think we did. Yeah, we generated them inside the room, and then measured them outside the room with a directional airflow, and then we adjusted that directional airflow and measured the protection factor, and that was with somebody going through the door. So even with somebody going through the door of the room, we still obtained quite a good protection factor.
And you then say that another researcher did work on negative pressure rooms and produced information about how they functioned.
Yes. I mean, the pressure differential is to me a monitor of how well the directional airflow is operating. But it's the directional airflow itself that is providing the protection.
Yeah.
Maybe just tease that out, Mr. Bennett. First of all, I'm going to write down what you've just said. The pressure differential is the measure, I think you said, did you say?
Yes.
Of the effectiveness of, did you say the
Directional airflow.
Airflow. As I say, can I invite you to sort of tease that out?
Okay. You'll have a room with a door, and air, for a negative pressure room, air will go from the outside into the room, maybe through a grill, maybe through the sides of the door, whatever mechanism. And that will cause a pressure differential across that door. which will be measured by a piece of equipment called a manometer, which you,
Right, and so if I'm following this, supply, all things being equal, will increase the pressure of the space into which the supply is going.
generally in the same room, if you increase the airflow going into the room, you will increase the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But different rooms may have different setups. So you could have a room that is very, very well sealed with a low inflow, but that would give you a very high negative pressure, but with a lower inflow. So the relationship between pressure differential and volumetric inflow will be dependent on the room setup.
Right, I interrupted you, but I was sort of inviting you to tease out what you were saying to Mr. Connell. Or have you maybe said what?
I think I just said it. I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, am I right in understanding that what you're trying to say is that the key is to have enough pressure to make sure the flow keeps going the way you want it? I can put it in layman's terms.
I don't necessarily think it's too important in this context, but what I'm saying is what is protecting you is the directional airflow, and the pressure differential is a way to monitor that is happening, and it's an easy way to monitor that.
So in paragraph 711, you say the pressure differential across the door needs to be maintained at a high enough level to protect against flow reversals. So
Yes.
is that your example from earlier about
Yes.
fluctuations one way or the other?
Yes. And that needs to be monitored just in case there's a problem.
And then you say people have tried setting up model rooms, but it's difficult to duplicate an actual hospital environment.
I think, well, every hospital is going to be different, and I think it is difficult. And one of the problems I find with so-called CFD modeling is that often there is no check that it is actually by experiment that the results obtained are correct. But
You then go on in the next section of your report to pick up some evidence about outbreaks, which you suggest may have been caused by ventilation deficiencies. There's some TB outbreaks mentioned, I think, in paragraph 714. Now, can I just get CDC, which you mentioned at various points in your report? Is that the Center for Disease Control in the US?
that's correct, yeah.
And is that a respected source for information on things like ventilation?
It's a respected source for information about infectious diseases and their prevention. So I think what happened in the 80s and 90s was tuberculosis became a real issue for HIV patients, and back in those days, many HIV patients were housed in hospitals because of the seriousness of their illnesses, and because they were in hospitals, that also had patients with tuberculosis, that facilitated the spread among that community, and with disastrous consequences.
And you instance various studies on page 640 and 641 in various locations, which you say are linked to low air change rates, among other things.
Well,
top of 641.
Well, that's the basically those papers blamed lack of negative pressure rooms and low air change rates for their outbreaks and the size of the outbreaks. And then the problem again is we come down to bundles. Is the CD guidance for TB isolation was not necessarily 100% about ventilation. It's also about other things. So, you know, but once that was adopted, the problem seems to have gone away or reduced.
And in fact, you make that point about what we've already identified as bundles in paragraph 716 of your report.
Yes.
That protective isolation is a range of measures. And you say it can be difficult to separate the impact. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So you know, I think it's very difficult to get significance that one thing works, but often it's easier if you're looking at a range of practices.
Yeah. And you deal on page 642 for some, you make some further comment about what the literature shows you. Although you pick up aspergillus, I see at the end of 717 in your report.
Yes.
Where HEPA filters seem to be the answer. Is that right?
Yes. I think those reports suggested that the use of HEPA filters had controlled outbreaks.
I want to move on to the guidance, which we've heard a lot about already. So I'll be able to take some of it fairly short, but if I just take the start of this, you deal with it initially on page 642, then you go on to 643, and you say, you accept at the top of the page that the guidance papers are the work of groups of experts, rely on a limited evidence base, and more on a practical assessment of best practice over the years. And what you then say is may be difficult for existing hospitals to comply, but it's expected that a new hospital would be built to meet existing guidance. And if it wasn't, there would be a written explanation for the logic. Can I just ask you about that? If you were going to not comply, would you expect any such derogation to be done if it impacted on patient safety?
I mean, I would think that anybody reading HTM 0301 or SHTM 0301 would regard it as being the guidance that should be used to construct a new hospital. And, you know, it's not an extreme document. It's a document that is developed by a very wide authors list who are pushing and pulling in different directions. So I would imagine, you know, I would think anybody who is building a hospital ventilation system would be using this as the basis of what they do. And if they weren't doing it, they would be giving an explanation for differences in approach.
So would you accept it, at least in principle, it's possible for a derogation to be made from that guidance, provided it's suitably explained?
I think, you know, there's certain principles expressed in the guidance. For example, you know, the air change rates that, you know, it's quite specific. It doesn't say 6 air changes for a ward and do what you like for a single room. It says 6 air changes for a single room. So I think an explanation would need to be afforded of why that wasn't regarded as being important in this brand new hospital.
Now, I think we know from a later section, but I'll just deal with it now, that you don't think you've seen any such explanation in relation to this hospital. anything written down at the time which explains why guidance was not to be followed?
I have seen the rationale appears to be to do with energy efficiency, BREEAM ratings, but there doesn't appear to have been any assessment of the impact of the reduced air change rate in terms of infection control and safety. So that I've not seen a document that looked at that decision from that sort of area.
Now, one point that I've been asked to put was whether you'd seen an email from an individual called Allan, which was written in 2016, so around about 7 years after these things were decided. I think you had seen that in the course of your work on this report, is that right?
I think I saw it yesterday.
Had you seen it before?
No. Well, I've seen. I can't say for definite I haven't seen it before, but I don't remember seeing it before.
Can we just look at that? It's bundle 12, page 813. Now, this obviously is written, as I said, in June 2016. And it says about halfway down, no reason for the decision to be made without the input and approval of those responsible for infection control. And then there's an example and so on. Is that the kind of document that you were talking about expecting to see, which explains the reasoning and justification?
Well, they seem to have had a lot of discussion, which I have not seen any notes or any. I don't know, but I mean, infection control people aren't necessarily experts on HTM 0301 or SHTM 0301, but they tend to respect documents like that and expect documents like that to be in the basis of a design. I would expect that. Yeah, I mean, well, he's basically saying there was a free and frank exchange of views. They're talking about design, dialogue, discussion. I mean, I would expect there to be written records of this process.
Yeah.
Well, apart from anything else, would you not expect the record to be contemporaneous with the decision?
Oh, yes, yes.
I mean, this is, first of all, it's an email.
Yeah.
It's an email which reflects the author's recollection of events, 7 years before?
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know whether you've asked Annette Rankin whether she's aware of any documentation, but.
Well, I think you can take it, Mr. Seaborn, having checked with both the authors of the questions I'm putting to you and the position was raised with a senior board representative. No such documents have been located as we sit here today, which are contemporaneous to that decision. Can I just ask also, I mean, there's some discussion as to whether the derogation covered all rooms or whether it was meant to be only general wards. Has it been part of your remit to try and interpret that contractual document at all?
No, no. I mean, I'm not an expert in contractual law, and
yeah, we'll maybe come back to that later, but that's not what you were, if you were going on a search for something, that's not what you would be looking for.
no.
Let's leave that email, thank you. Can I just bring you back just before we break perhaps to this whole question of the guidance? Can we go back to the witness statement at 643? And you referenced there someone called Malcolm Thomas. Now, you say he was the lead author of many of the editions. So is this somebody who'd been around the hospital ventilation circuit for a long time?
Yes.
And you obviously think what he says there is significant because you quoted in his report. And he says that HTM 0301 is based on good solid work many years ago where we've encountered problems. It's generally been clear that guidance wasn't followed. And then you quote in the next paragraph, ventilation rates are not opinion, they've been proven to work in practice, and over an extended period of hospital design and operation, history appears to show that this is the correct way of doing things. Now, just in terms of your reading of the materials, do you agree or disagree with what Mr. Thomas is quoted as saying there?
Well, it's his own opinion, and you know, you have to take that at face value. You know, I think, he believes that the HTM 0301 is a document based on good science, and that it's shown to work in practice.
I think the question was, if you're in a position to answer it, Mr. Bennett, would you agree with that?
I would agree that he's the person who would have the best insight into that, and I would agree in that basis. I mean, I don't have
Are you deferring to someone who has a particular reputation, or are you coming to a conclusion on the basis of your own experience? I mean, maybe
a mixture. I mean, I think you have to.
I think in my experience, the point is, Mr. Bennett, I'm particularly interested in your view because you're here as opposed to Mr. Thomas, who's not here.
I mean, in my experience, having a document that gives advice on how to design and build a hospital and has been in that format pretty well for 20 years and is an accepted way of doing things, I think you go with it. That you have to accept that as being your Bible. You have to accept it as being the best way of doing things. So, and as far as I'm aware, there's not been major problems with ventilation when people have adopted the practices within HTM 0301.
Thank you.
And I think what he says in 721, I think is important, is one thing when people are maybe moving into new sectors, like, for example, if there are, and I don't know about the background of some of the companies involved with this, but if you're moving into a new area and you're not 100% familiar with the background, documents like this become very, very important to you. And you can't just swat them away, in my point of view.
This might be an appropriate point, my lord, to break.
Mr. Bennett, as I said, we usually take a coffee break at about 11:30. Could I ask you to be back for 5 to 12?
That's very generous.
Right. And I hope you get a cup of coffee.
Thank you.
Assistant.
what I managed to do is to leave my notebook and my report. Right, my apologies. Ladies and gentlemen, I brought one folder, but left the other folder and the notebook in my room. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Excellent. Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Bennett, can I just ask you one question to see whether you're able to help us or not that relates to some evidence we touched on earlier about PPVL rooms?
Yes.
And you remember at one point you were assisting His Lordship understand what the phrase room junction meant.
Yes.
And that was in relation to where filters might be placed.
Yes.
Are you able to help us at all to what impact on the operation of a so-called PPVL room there might be if the HEPA filter was in the ceiling of the room?
When you right, when you say the ceiling of the room, that's the bedroom.
The bedroom.
Which is protected.
The bedroom.
Right. Yep.
So the supply filter is in the ceiling and not in the. I mean, I mean, if it, in my viewpoint, as long as the ducts are all right, and as long as it's serviced and maintained all right, I can't see much of a problem. I would defer to possibly Andrew Poplett's viewpoint in that as somebody with more expertise in what actually happens practically in hospitals.
Thank you. As it happened, we got to page 645 of your witness statement, report. And oddly enough, the next topic you touch on is HEPA filters. You narrate there that one of the issues with HEPA filters is sometimes said to be cost. Going to 646, you note a reference in SHTM 0301 to a risk assessment for use of filters, and you note, well, it seems to be talking about cost, not infection control. And you're perhaps a little surprised, it appears, that there's not more emphasis on precisely where and when HEPA should be used in the guidance. Is that right?
As somebody who doesn't know the HTMs off by heart, I was surprised by how almost negative the focus was on for HEPA filters, and I find I was just surprised. I was surprised. I was wondering whether it was because they felt it was mentioned in other documents. That's the only thing I could think of.
And you deal with this on page 647, near the foot of the page, where you say the advice on the use of high-grade filters in UK and Scottish guidance is patchy and not helpful, but there is guidance available from America.
I mean, I think that's an interesting aspect, is that, you know, especially with the Beatson, to what extent they actually look towards international experts to build a facility. Of course, that was back in the 1990s, but yeah.
So that's you're thinking of the bone marrow transplant unit for adults in the Beatson Hospital before the time when it was moved over to the
Yes.
Queen Elizabeth. And I think we know from other evidence that they took some advice from an American expert at that time.
That's correct, yes.
Now, you then walk us through some of these other issues. You deal on page 648 with air change rates, where you point out where these are covered. You say the air change rates have been in place and remained stable since 2007. And then pressure regimes didn't appear prior to 2005, is that right?
I couldn't find any reference in the HTMs.
Yeah, and you think that might have been American influence again from CDC?
I would think so. You know, I think, you know, to some extent, a lot of countries take their lead from what is done by CDC.
And you say in terms of the detail and how that's worked out on page 649 that the pressure differential advice has remained consistent essentially since 2005.
Yes.
Right? And then you make a point about the need for proper monitoring systems, which we've probably taken from other witnesses, and I needn't trouble you to go in any great detail. Now, can I just take you to another topic that I promised to return to, which was chilled beams? And can I just say in introduction to this, that if I talk about chilled beams, I'm not going to get into a debate as to whether the precise piece of kit installed in the new hospital was technically a chilled beam or something similar to a chilled beam, because we're just going to try and deal with this generally. And you touch on that at page 652, and you say that the first time it appears is in 2007 in the guidance.
Yes.
And then you go on to quote a number of the provisions from different iterations of both HTM and SHTM 0301. Is that right?
Yep.
And then you go on to point out that while things like maintenance requirements had cropped up, access and cleaning cropped up in 2009, by 2021 and 2022, obviously after this hospital has been built, things have changed in the guidance.
Yes, yeah, there seems to be a realization that these can cause problems and they should be removed from patient areas.
Yeah. And what you actually quote there on page 654 is, I think, the wording we've probably seen with others. They talk about regular cleaning, and it says in clinical areas and patient bedrooms, routine access will be a major problem in an operational hospital. And then patient bedrooms, chill beam should not be installed in clinical areas without the agreement in writing of the VSG. Now that's a reference to ventilation safety group, which also emerges later in the guidance. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you pick up the fact that there's always been reference to dew point controls, but clearly the approach to chilled beams has shifted.
Yes.
Now, is that a shift between the first appearance in the guidance in 2007 and where we are in the latter guidance at 2021, 2022?
I mean, I think it must have been because of reports of negative aspects of their use. You know, I think also an understanding that the maintenance schedule may be more than a once every 6 month visit. So that seems to be the advice given by the manufacturers and in the early adapts, but then it seems to become a thing that they need more regular maintenance, and then that makes access to patient rooms become more problematic.
And then the next topic you touch on again is something we've heard of from some other witnesses, which is that the need, if you're having pressurized rooms, to have appropriate seals,
Yes.
sealed rooms. Is that right?
Yes.
I don't know whether you agree with, I think another witness may have said something along the lines of there isn't much point installing a pressurized system if the room isn't sealed. Would you agree with that?
Well, you can't protect against leaks from the room if the room is as a false ceiling and is not sealed. So yes.
So a false ceiling in the sense of a lowered ceiling would be all right, but it would have to be a sealed ceiling.
Yes. But it's constructed in such a way that it's sealed. The problem is you could probably seal this ceiling by using a lot of silicon sealant, but 2 weeks later it would be sealed because deterioration.
Yeah. You're pointing out that because this is a grid system of ceiling tiles of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what you essentially do in the next couple of pages is pick up references to the need for a sealed environment, and then you come to a conclusion on that, I think at 657 in paragraph 761.
Yes.
That the reference to control of pressure will be problematic.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to leak test a room and you've got a false ceiling, then it's not going to pass your leak test, your leakage rate test.
Yeah, we're just about to come to that. I just wanted to ask you about that because at least one other witness we've heard had something to say about what this idea of leak testing means. I mean, does it mean it doesn't leak, or does it mean that it leaks within certain parameters?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the leak testing that in this document, but normally you carry a leak test and you expect a leak rate, because nothing is totally sealed. I mean, if it's totally sealed, the whole room will collapse in a leak test, but you expect some sort of leakage, but that leakage needs to be defined as being appropriate. And here they say 1 litre a second of air per cubic metre of the envelope volume. So that is therefore they've set a parameter to be met. So if it meets that parameter, that's great. If it doesn't, then they may want to do some investigation to where the air is leaking.
And essentially what you do in the next couple of pages of your witness statement is you pick up what the different guidance documents say at different points about the question of, well, I think it was called permeability.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So going to 660, this just gives rise to a general question, I suspect, about when would you need backup air handling? Or why would you need backup air handling? Is that a question you can answer or not?
I probably can't answer. I'm not really familiar with the uses of backup air handling units in hospitals. Basically, you would need a backup air handling unit if you need to switch one off but keep the facility operational. So you may want to switch one off because you want to maintain it. You may want to switch off because you want to do some test work on it. Or it may be a belt and braces approach. Oh my God, what happens if one fails? We've got another one going. But I must admit, it's not an area I'm familiar with the practice in hospital environments. So
Thank you. And again, in the next section, much of what you're doing is narrating for us what the guidance says when we're dealing with the question of commissioning, which is part of the process of ensuring that the ventilation system does what it says on the tin, essentially.
yes,
And in the pages that run from 661 onwards, you're setting out a series of requirements and guidance, including reference, I think, to the COSH regulations as part of that picture. Is that right?
Can I just check, small matter of detail, in relation to the party report which deals with commissioning, I'm assuming you're adopting, because of your references to the SHTM 0301, the definition of commissioning that we see in either the 2014 or the 2022 versions. In other words, commissioning is something that's done during the course of construction
yes,
by the contractor or specialist subcontractor in relation to specific items of plant.
yes. Make sure
Thank you.
the errors in the design.
Sorry, Mr. Collins.
I don't think I'll ask you to read through that part of your report because essentially you're quoting from various guidance documents. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, and I think for the intricacies of commissioning and validation, I think Andrew is far more experienced and knowledgeable than I am.
Yes, well, in fact, in the narrative sequence of your report, validation then crops up at 667, where you quote the COSH regulations. You quote part of HTM 0301, which in turn refers to the regulations, and then you quote over the page a version of validation that we've heard about, that the system will be acceptable if it is considered fit for purpose and will only require routine maintenance. But you defer to Andrew Poplet on the details of validation, is that right?
I think I'd be better.
Yeah. So you set out the information that's provided in the documents about that, and then also about annual verification. Is that right?
Yes.
So if we go to 673, and you've just picked up a piece of information that you happen to have individual knowledge of. Is that right, in relation to tuberculosis?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think it's an interesting aspect. Is not necessarily everything works dovetailed or joins together in this sort of area.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think in the NICE guidance, they're talking about 10 pascals negative pressure, while in the SATM, I think they talk about -5 pascals for a isolation room. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, just to make sure we have the reference that you're looking at there. On 674, you talk about the NICE tuberculosis guidance, and then you set out a table, but the reference to 10 pascals, I think, appears at the top of 675, where you say there's a definition of a negative pressure room, and then a reference to 10 pascals. Yep. So that's what they're talking about for TB.
That appears to be, yes, yeah.
And then we pick up the international or United States influence in a section on that. It starts on that page you make the point that it's an international profession, medicine.
Yes, and practices will come into being maybe before there is actually guidance. And guidance may, UK guidance may lag behind international guidance in some areas. So when the Beatson was constructed, there wasn't, as far as I'm aware, I haven't gone back that far, but there wasn't necessarily documents telling them how to do it in the UK. So they approached experts in the US.
And you suggest at the foot of that page that the Centre for Disease Control is especially influential, and also the World Health Organization. Does WHO get involved in this kind of issue?
It can, but I don't think it does in this. The WHO has got the problem the WHO has, well, not a problem, but the WHO has to cater for the global, on a global basis. So therefore, they are going to be interested in more sustainable and achievable standards that can be met worldwide. Well, the CDC guidance is more aimed firstly at the US, but also maybe at more developed countries.
I mean, just maybe at risk of repetition, you're using the example of WHO. Their constituency is worldwide, and therefore, does that mean that when they are a source of recommendations, their audience is countries with very limited health resources, as well as countries with greater health resources, such as Western Europe or North America?
Exactly. So their recommendations are global recommendations. And for example, recommending that every country in the world, say, for example, just pulling this one out, has HEPA filters on TB wards, and they need to be tested every 12 months. If you're in a country that doesn't have a company who can do that service, it's totally unrealistic. So they would possibly strip out something like that.
Thank you.
Well, if we just go to the next page, 676, we'll see a short discussion. I'm not going to take you to all the quotations, but you've identified CDC guidance as a gold standard. Why do you say that?
I mean, I think at that time, the CDC this was the first document that was making those suggestions, and that obviously, and it was quite high level. You can see that they're talking about 12 air changes, and we ended up with 10 air changes. That's it. I think what's happening is something gradually with medicine and other areas. Somebody has a new idea, and that idea maybe spreads and then has currency, and then it becomes adapted as best practice and then guidance documents. And I think this is what happened with the CDC guidance. The UK's not followed it completely, but they've incorporated ideas from it.
Yeah, I think you're making the point that there was guidance from the US, which had been through a series of editions, which you might expect a new hospital to take account of.
Yes, I mean, you'd expect. I mean, somebody who is at cutting edge of, say, bone marrow transplantation will be aware of the scientific literature, will attend meetings, and this sort of stuff will be discussed, and they will be aware of it. They won't be engineers, and they won't be state staff, and they won't be able to maybe understand the details, but they'll be aware of the information.
What you've then done, I think, is to extract a number of comments from, I think, from the CDC guidance. Is that right?
That's correct, yes, yes, just,
On different topics.
yes.
I just want to take you through one of them in particular. Near the foot of page 676, we'll see what kind of protective environment is in a moment. It says it's a specialist patient care area, usually in a hospital with a positive airflow. So that sounds like someone with an compromised position. And it says the combination of HEPA filtration, high numbers of air changes per hour, more than 12, and minimal leakage of air into the room creates an environment that can safely accommodate patients who have undergone allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So that's the kind of guidance that was coming out from the States in the 1990s, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So HEPA filtration, high number of air changes, and then minimum leakage. No doubt there are ways of achieving that.
Yes.
And then you instance various other sections. If we just move on briefly then to 6, 7, 8, to see the tailpiece to this useful collection of information. You say that these documents were prepared by expert groups set up by CDC, regularly reviewed, and the guidance was freely available. So is this again a gathering of practice rather than research?
Yeah, I mean, this is documents that are freely available from CDC and published in scientific journals that are read by people who are specialists in this field.
And in fact, then we pick up the reference just in that paragraph to the individual who helped with the Beatson, which is Andrews Streifel or Streifel. Yes. Thank you. Now, I think earlier you said that not everything slots neatly into everything else in this field when we were talking about the NICE figures.
Yes.
The next topic you pick up is the Joint Accreditation Committee, of JACIE.
Yes.
Which we've heard arises, we've heard referred to as an accreditation that bone marrow transplant units seek.
Yes.
And the 6th edition that you've quoted here from the JACIE accreditation material, do you know when that is dated? If you don't, it doesn't matter, we'll check it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's from their website. I mean, I find it quite difficult to, I couldn't track back on the editions.
No, it may not matter, Mr. Bennett.
I mean, I think the one thing about this is an international organization, a bit like WHO. So they're not saying you should have like 10 air changes plus 10 in a HEPA filtered room, because they're dealing with countries at I'm not totally familiar with the organization. I don't know their scope, but I understand they're at least Europe wide.
Yeah.
So they're dealing with countries who maybe don't have the infrastructure. So they can't just like not accredit they're not going into the specifics.
I mean, it's a similar point to the one that you made in relation to WHO.
Yes.
If a body is seeking to lay down minimum standards for countries all over the world, or even a large number of countries, you've got to bear in mind, well, not every country can be expected to have the same resources.
Yes.
I suppose the qualification in relation to the Joint Accreditation Committee is that it appears to be, or the recommendations that you've drawn attention to relate to facilities for hematopoietic cellular therapy. So that's setting
Yes.
the bar for the sophistication of the treatment reasonably high.
Yes.
Right.
I think part of this actually goes back to a previous comment I made about room selection. What they seem to be suggesting here is you need a process to prioritize the patients who get the best rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be done on the basis of a clinical assessment of the patient, I would imagine. And they also say that auditing of airborne microbial infections in non-HEPA rooms should be performed as part of a quality management program.
Yes, you're referring to a section of your report at 797, where you've extracted something from the JC guidance, where they at least posit the possibility that you may not have enough HEPA filtered rooms for your needs.
Yes.
And then say what you have to do about it.
Yes, and what you do about it is come up with a process of allocating the rooms to the patients most in need.
Yeah. But the heading you've selected immediately above that, perhaps a more general statement, refers to a unit of adequate space and design that minimises airborne microbial contamination. So if that's the objective, then you look at the detail.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of writing legislation. There's the prescriptive, you will have this and that. Then there's what's the other one? Then there's this sort of thing which gives you a sort of a performative idea, but doesn't actually prescribe how you do it.
Yeah. So yes. So you accept that the JC material isn't prescriptive in its detail as what you have to do to minimize airborne microbial contamination. Is that right?
Well, I mean, then it says HEPA filtration with positive pressure is recommended for high-risk patients. Yeah. You know, but I suppose it's a matter of language. Because that's when I have to say I'm not a clinician. So the clinicians are the ones who should be able to separate patients out into high risk to lower risk. And that's one thing I've been a wee... This seems to be suggesting that you should do that, and that should be written as an SOP, and that should indicate where patients should be housed during their treatment.
And you essentially your tailpiece to this review of material is simply to note that the Beatson Centre BMT unit pre-move had this ventilation system designed in a particular way with assistance from Andrew Streifel and indeed Peter Hoffman, with an air change rate of 10 and 10 positive pascals.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was a group, I think all the patients were housed in a ward, but that ward, was under those conditions, yes.
Yes, you note that there's an airlock, but that's an airlock to get into the ward.
Yes,
as opposed to into individual rooms. Thank you. Now, the next section of your report picks up what you say are deficiencies in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital compared to guidance, and you look only at a limited number of wards, as you say in paragraph 8.2. And what you say in that is that these were all used to house patients with immunosuppression at some time between 2015 and now. Now, would I be right in thinking that you know that 6A was used on a, let's call it a temporary basis, that people were moved in, they were there for a while, and then at a later stage they were eventually moved out?
That's my understanding, yes.
And you also touch on 5C and D, which is infectious diseases. So what you're then setting out, as I understand it, Mr. Bennett, is a kind of narrative going through the different wards and picking up on what the differences are when you look at the guidance.
Yes, and also some of the wards were modified during the period, so I've looked at how those modifications changed the status.
And you start off on page 682 by picking up general wards, so not one of the list, where you point out that the guidance requires 6, that wasn't achieved, that the chill beams are there, which is contrary to the latest versions, but not the versions of the guidance at the time the hospital was built.
Yes.
And then you go on to Ward 2A. Now there is, Inquiry has actually produced a separate paper on specialist ventilation areas, but you cite the guidance from the UK and from Scotland about 10 air changes, positive pressure, and also you mentioned what York Hill had, which is where essentially the 2A patients were beforehand.
Yes.
And then you cite something that we've heard about from other witnesses, that when patients started to move into the hospital, issues started to be picked up on what the quality of the environment was for those patients in 2015. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
And that, I take it, is material that you simply gathered from the documents that were provided to you by the inquiry.
Yes, yes, yes.
And then you instance on 684 that they were moved out of the ward into 4B and 6A after 3 years of being housed in a substandard facility. And some discussion about dew points and chilled beams. And then you pick up the fact that ultimately there was a lot of work done, but it's simplified. Chill beams, thermal wheel, suspended ceilings to be removed, all rooms sealed, airlock, backup air handling unit, pressure monitoring, all in the specification which you instance in paragraph 813 of your report. And then you pick up on a validation report from 22. So your conclusion, I think, is in 815. Is that a positive conclusion about the state of Ward 2A?
Yes, yes. It looked, I mean, when I visited, it looked very swish and very impressive.
And I take it you're assuming that it performs in accordance with the validation details that you set out above?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the validation reports from 2023 or 2024, but I've got no indication that they were not suitable.
Now, we then come to Ward 4B, which is the adult bone marrow transplant unit. Now, are you aware that the decision to move that into the Queen Elizabeth was taken during the construction process?
I think yeah, I mean, there's so many documents. Yeah, I think I was aware of that, yes.
Are you in a position to comment one way or the other on whether the date at which that decision was taken impacted on the options available to cater for this cohort of patients?
Well, the hospital, there were, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any part of the hospital designed to meet the standards that would be expected for those patients, because the hospital was generally designed on the sort of general ward principle.
Yeah, I think what, yeah, so it was designed on the general ward. I'm not sure whether you can help us with this or not, Mr. Bennett, but let me just ask you anyway. So if somebody comes along and says, we want to move the Beatson BMT unit into the new hospital, this is the kind of requirements that we have. Can you help us or not as to whether that was difficult to do, easy to do, or anything of that kind?
It's very difficult. I mean, retrofitting ventilation systems into buildings will involve quite a lot of work, and maybe a bit of building redesign. And since the ward was designed to have 2.5-year changes, to increase that to 10-year changes would mean increasing the capacity of the plant by fourfold, which would require, I would imagine, it would require the whole HVAC system to be stripped out and replaced. So it would be an expensive and a time-consuming process.
Again, I don't, you may or may not know this, so please just tell me if you don't. Have you been made aware of any exchanges between the contractors and the board about what could or could not be done within the existing building envelope on air changes?
I think I've seen documents. I forget. Sorry, I mean, there's so many documents. But I think I've seen documents about what could and could not be achieved for various wards to improve the ventilation system. There was discussions about duct sizes, because you can only get so much air through a size of duct, so you need to increase the size of duct. So there, I think I've seen such reports.
The question I suspect is, I'll ask you more specifically then, are you aware of any discussion as to whether 10 air changes could be achieved with the existing air handling units?
I think, yeah, I've seen such documents, and it couldn't be achieved.
It couldn't be achieved?
Yes.
So that would mean either accepting a lower air change unit or stripping out the existing ones, presumably?
Yes, as I remember, yeah.
And the point you make in your report is that the Beatson had been designed with input from international and national experts and was regarded as an exemplary facility. Then you explain what it had. And then, as we know, ultimately it moved over and then moved out again.
I mean, as I remember, the decision seemed to be made to allow patients rapid access to intensive care.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not a clinician. You know, I don't know whether somebody thought that they could drop this was of greater benefit to the patients than having the Beatson facility or having a worse facility. I don't know whether I've not seen any evidence that those things are weighed together, but I know that was the rationale given for the move.
I think that would be the move. I'm right in thinking we know that the Beatson patients moved into the new hospital and then, after not very long, moved back to the Beatson.
Yes.
So you'd be talking about the move back into the new hospital, once there'd been some discussion about what could or could not be done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not sure of the timescales of some of this sort of stuff. But yeah.
Well, perhaps we can pick that up at page 687, where, having listed a number of the deficiencies that were identified, you note at 820 that the decision was taken to return patients to the Beatson unit in July 2015, and then in 821 a series of works were carried out and patients seem to have returned in July 2018, and then you set out some details of a number of the works.
Yes.
That were done, and what they did or didn't show. So can we come to your tailpiece on this topic, which is on 688? Just take us through what your point is in paragraph 822.
I just think, you know, it's the fact that they built a facility in the Beatson that seems to meet the requirements at SHTM 0301 and was a well-designed, good facility, and the patients have been moved into a facility that is of a lower standard. I mean, I think what people are used to is things becoming of a better standard, and I think it's a little bit disappointing.
Now, I've been asked to put this to you. Do you think, given the difficulties that were encountered, as it were, retrofitting and improving, which led to the position that you've illustrated, given that these patients would be better with a new unit?
Sorry, could I have the question again, Mr. Connell?
Yeah. Given the recognised difficulties in retrofitting, some of which you've illustrated in your report, and if this is not for you, just say, do you agree that the board should be looking at delivering a new unit to higher standards for that cohort of patients?
Well, I would imagine that's a decision of the board. I mean, I think, to be fair, the air change rate, they've managed to step up a bit better. I mean, I don't like the fact they've got neutral pressure rooms. I mean, I think you can argue a bit about how many pascals positive gives you a safety margin, but the fact that some of the rooms were neutral pressure, I think there's these are a lot of these decisions are clinical and financial and operational, and I think those are a matter for a board to consider.
Sure.
I mean, to be fair to them, they've improved the facility. But there is I don't know, I'm from Glasgow, and I remember stories about this hospital being the greatest hospital in the world, or going to be a shining star in Glasgow. And in that context, it is a little bit disappointing, I think. Maybe that's too personal a thing to say, but
The next section of your evidence, you move on. We've dealt with 4B, which is where the BMT unit is, to 4C, whether hemato-oncology patients, and you say that there are deficiencies on that ward for that cohort of patients. Is that right?
yes.
Can I pick up a technical matter that hasn't appeared, I think, yet in your report, and I'm not sure elsewhere, which appears at 828 on page 690, which is something called a recirculating camphil HEPA filter.
Yes.
What's that?
From my memory, they have ceiling mounted a device made by a company called Camphil, in which air is recirculated through a HEPA filter and comes back into the room. So it's like a portable HEPA filter, but it's located in the ceiling, and it's of I would imagine, because Camphil are a big company, it's of probably a higher standard, and they could probably test the HEPA filter. I don't know if they did, but they probably could.
And why would you have what you describe as an unusual feature of one of these filters? Why would it be there? Do you know?
It seems to be. They seem to have had some aspergillus growth in some of the en-suites, and there were I think they found aspergillus, and there were high particle counts in en-suites. So they put in these units to reduce the contamination levels. But I felt that, I mean, the patient isn't going to spend that much time in the en-suite. The air should be going from the bedroom into the en-suite, the air directions. I wasn't quite sure to what extent it would be protecting the patient.
I wonder if I can try and follow this. I mean, the ensuite is negative to the bedroom.
Yes, slightly, yes, yeah.
And the intended flow will be from the bedroom into the ensuite.
Yes.
I think I would have assumed, and then to be extracted.
It will be extracted as well.
But this filter unit is dealing with the air that's come from the bedroom, but it sort of does a circuit within. I mean, I'm following this properly, but the airflow does a circuit through the filter.
Yes, yeah. So basically, it cleans up.
And it is then extracted.
It will, yes, yeah. So it will provide I mean, it's not strictly an air change, but it will clean a certain amount of the air in the ensuite, which will take out particulate in the ensuite, but then it'll be extracted. I must admit, when I visited, I think some of the current members of staff were almost as confused about it as I was. So as I say, it seems, because the door would normally be closed as well. So it just seemed a wee bit, I don't know, but maybe there's a great idea behind this that I've missed, so.
The idea that you've suggested might be behind it is to reduce particle counts in the en-suites.
It might be. I mean, it might be they set a target for a level of particles that they couldn't meet without the use of such a unit. I don't know. That's a possibility.
And then another feature that you noticed, apart from these recirculating filters, was portable HEPA filters in that ward. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
And that gives rise to the issues that we've discussed already about portable filters. It depends precisely where they are, how effective they are.
Yes, yes. And what Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know whether there was a rationale for placement or a rationale for anything like that, or rationale for the numbers used.
They were all at floor level. You made a point, I think, at the end
I
of it.
wasn't. I didn't have access to patient rooms, so the ones in the corridor were on floor level. I'm not sure. I cannot make any comment on what went on in the rooms.
So these were HEPA filters in the corridor of 4C.
As I remember, yes. But I don't know whether as I said, I don't know whether there are ones in the rooms. I didn't have access to the rooms. I don't.
I think the only other point I want to take about 4C, if I may, is one that crops up in paragraph 830, just before the bit about HEPA filters, where you've been given a risk assessment from 2021, and perhaps you can just explain to us what a risk rating of 9 means.
Well, it's with risk ratings. They have. I think this one had a probability. You have a 5x5 matrix of probability against severity, and each of them is marked on a scale of 1 to 5, and then you choose how likely something is to happen, in your opinion, and the severity of it happening, and you multiply those ratings together to give yourself a risk rating. So in this risk assessment, the people who were agreeing the risk assessment came to a conclusion that there may occur occasionally severe illness from airborne pathogen exposure in this ward in the risk assessment.
Right. So that the way the matrix worked
Yes.
out, it ended up
Yeah.
with
So three is
occasionally and severe and so on.
Yeah.
So occasionally severe illness from airborne pathogen exposure.
Yes.
That's what the assessment says.
Yeah.
Do we know who carried out that risk assessment? I mean, I'm looking at the footnote is 140, but risk assessment.
It will be, I believe, my lord, in bundle 20 somewhere, and I've no doubt we could find that if that was thought helpful.
If I've understood the explanation you give in relation to the matrix, the highest risk would be 10. Is that right?
No, 5x5. It'd be 25.
Would be 25.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. So it's 9 on a scale of 0 to 25.
Yeah. So it's three is a multiplication. Yes.
I think, my lord, I was about to turn on to a new topic, so this might be an appropriate time to break.
Yes, Mr. Bennett, we'll take our lunch now. So could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?
Of course.
President,